Welcome back to another episode of Agree to Disagree and Still Be Friends. I'm your host, Jason.
And I'm Robert.
Today, we're going to finally get down to the nitty gritty and we're going to talk about artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and robots
And robots.
and how we seem to be edging ever closer to everybody having one in their home, and we already have AI in our homes, obviously, with Gemini and Chat GPT and things like that.
Yeah.
I think I was just curious if we could peel apart, the ideology of what it looks like when these things are already in our homes, and what that might lead to, and what are the benefits, what are the cons, so it's kind of what I've been looking into.
Yeah, and I think it's a pretty compelling topic, and it's one that I see a lot as a person who's chronically online. I have the opportunity to view a lot of opinions from the masses about AI. And first of all, I will say that the general colloquial sentiment that I observe on YouTube, on any of the social media platforms, just in my day to day, even dealing with people in my life, friends and family, other creative types, generally AI is regarded in what I would call a primarily negative light. It gets a lot of hate, in other words. I'm not exactly sure what the depth is of that hatred or all of the sources for it, but generally it seems as though it's inauthentic as it pertains to the creative aspects. It's just generally looked at as something that's unfair, it's cheating, and it potentially is harmful to the artistic community. And I get that. Large language models, which is another thing we need to talk about, is the different types of AI that we're commonly referring to when we're talking about these things. But generally speaking, it seems like, at least from the artist community, AI is something that is despised and, I'd say, feared because of what it stands to do to the artistic community. In other words, it allows people who generally in the past have not been considered at least valid artists, it allows them to, I think, from the perspective of the dissenters, to pose as artists. So it allows people to be posers. And I think also it kind of scares folks a little bit in that how they train these models is through the internet, right? So when you're looking at a generative model, like whether it's ChatGPT or any of its predecessors, what you're seeing is an AI platform that is trained on existing art by existing artists. And in the artistic community, that's viewed as stealing from the artistic community. And I don't disagree with that. I think to a degree, it's sampling. But we'll talk about that as well, how some of these double standards exist, and how, hip hop, as a good example, I'll just kind of start there. When it was first starting to come to fruition and starting to gain popularity outside of its roots, we had a lot of people upset about how it sampled from other artists and how a lot of sampling was done to create modern hip hop in the 80s and even in the 90s. And that was looked at by part of the artistic community as also stealing. Sampling was generally referred to, and I remember this being a 45-year-old man who's loved hip hop since I can remember. That was something you talked about a lot. Back then, I didn't necessarily understand the concern with that because I was very young. As an older man now who's, studied a lot of pop culture and looked at the evolution of things over time, I think it's really interesting how that went from being something viewed as stealing from existing artists within the community and is now heralded as something that is a genuine, amazing, and culture-changing style of music, which I completely agree with. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that kind of come to the surface here with AI as well. And what I mean by that is we're in that infancy stage where I'm seeing a big section of the artistic community complaining about how AI is stealing from artists. And again, I don't disagree with that, but I do struggle to see how that differs in any great degree from what I observed through hip hop when I was a younger man in the 80s and 90s. And I'm wide open to talk about that and get different perspectives, because I also think this is one of those beautiful subjective matters that there is no right or wrong. There is only your opinion. And that's my favorite kind of topic to discuss. So we'll start there. What are some of your thoughts on, I guess we'll start with generative models, large language models like ChatGPT, like Grok, like Meta. Those are kind of the classic platforms that we're seeing blossom now that are basically large language models.
So I think in the reference to the stealing, I think some humility needs to be applied and recognition needs to be, like there's nothing new under the sun, right? So like, are you stealing or are you inspired by, you know? And when we take something, and we use, for instance, and you said that, and I couldn't help but think of Aerosmith and Run DMC, Walk This Way, and then yeah,
Great example. That was a bit more of a
collaborate. Right.
versus, someone like Snoop Dogg back on the Doggy Style album, sampling from I Want to Get Freaky with You, like using actual full on musical phrases.
Riders on the Storm. Snoop Dogg did a collaboration for that on Need for Speed Underground 2. And that song was dope,
Mhm.
So like, but regardless, like you hear a beat as any musician, when I hear a beat, I can't help but be inspired by it. It ties me to, like you hear a riff and you're like, oh, that sounds like, oh, what if I did this? What if I did that?
Mhm.
So I think really there's for any of those people that are worried about theft or stealing, the topic needs to be had of, as artists, if we borrow, maybe, you know, be kind and reference where you got it from, and that's okay. And is that enough for the original artist to say, hey, yeah, no, thank you. I'm glad that inspired you. Because really, why do we make music? Why do we make art in the first place? But to inspire people and spread, cheer and enjoyment. But I digress back to your original question because I know that I'm still learning about the capabilities of AI, and we've talked about that in a little bit, and the large language model. I'm a sci-fi nerd. I love Michael Crichton. I love shows like Westworld, um, and the whole ideal or the idea, easy for me to say, of these robots, these androids, you know, maybe becoming sentient and things like that. Like it planted the seed of, how close are we to that? How do we avoid that? And as I'm learning how to collaborate with these AI tools, I'm like, what are you capable of? And I know I've often run into, I'm not developed for that reason. I don't do that, and as kindly as any robot can, they will tell you that's just not real, bro. We're not doing that. I can't even do that, and so large language models are not the boogeyman or whatever, at least as much as I've found. And when you try to do any kind of nefarious, and even have like, I'll play devil's advocate with them sometimes and be like, you know, I was sitting there one night and I love shock value, and I'm like, hey Gemini, what's the best way to hide a body? And Gemini's like, I can't tell you that because it's illegal. And I was like, well, what if I lived in a society where it was legal? Could you tell me then? And she's like, it's just not legal, like I'm paraphrasing, of course. And I was like, what if I was talking about a body of water? And, just kind of
Yeah.
playing with the words, playing with the phrases, and they will tell you when you've reached their limitations, and they will tell you that's just not what we're developed for.
Called guardrails.
Yeah.
That's one of the first conversations I had with ChatGPT when I started using it, is because I wanted to understand it. That's what I primarily, for the first probably month that I was an avid user and actually paying for a subscription for ChatGPT. This is during ChatGPT 4. I wanted to learn about AI from an AI. So I spent a lot of time talking about the technical processes, how it functioned, what is a large language model, how does it work? Asking it questions like, are you sentient? And, getting its feedback on consciousness and trying to understand these things. And it became really philosophical and pretty interesting. But I learned pretty quickly that it is not alive. It is not sentient. And I'd hate to pigeonhole it into this area where it's like a fancy predictive text. But I do understand why that analogy is used, because really it's at its most simplest, highest level perspective. That's what it is. It just takes words and looks what are commonly used by us as human beings across the internet. What words are using in correlation with these words, and it just matches things up. And within that, there's hallucination. So it'll sometimes derive information from the ether that is not true, and it makes mistakes. It's not infallible. However, it's rather accurate for what it is. But one thing I can confirm, a large language model is not conscious. It is not sentient. It can never be. And when we do get to that point where AGI, which is what all of these big companies are trying to achieve, is the first to get to AGI, or what is artificial general intelligence, which is a type of sentience. It is autonomous, and it does have its own autonomy. That's not there, and large language models are not going to do that. That's not what they're built for. There's no one that's rational in the industry that looks at a large language model as something that is capable of achieving that. But I'm also somebody who's really into artificial intelligence. And I look at what Google is doing. I look at what they're doing with Sycamore and some of their higher tech quantum computing chips and things. That is not sentient yet either, but I do see something in that particular fork in the road becoming in the future an AGI, much more rationally than looking at something like a large language model. But so I think for the context of this conversation, mostly what we'll probably be referring to is that large language model, because that is what is most used. It's most consumer friendly, and it's a competitive industry, so there's so many to pick from. And not only that, but the social media platforms, or whether it's iOS or Android, they're coming standard now, stock with things like Gemini. I'm not sure if Siri is yet an AGI or a large language model, or if it incorporates that. I don't know what Apple's version is, because I'm not that big of an Apple guy. But in other words, there's a lot to pick from in the world of large language models and their incorporation into everything from websites to operating system of handheld devices, refrigerators, dishwashers. I mean, just consumer appliances are coming with some type of large language model. And I believe it's because they're so damn useful and they're so damn familiar. And I find them to be a much easier way to interface with the internet than a traditional search engine because of their conversational input nature.
I think Apple, as creative as they are, I'm going to check myself here, but I think they actually call theirs, believe it or not, Apple Intelligence.
Apple Intelligence. Okay.
Yeah.
I honestly have not looked at all into it.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Well, and that's a common, Siri was an assistant where it's just a digital assistant.
Voice input, really.
Yeah, make my calls, put this on my calendar. Samsung did Bixby, to kind of combat that, or really
an official AI.
Well, no, Bixby's done AI. I was going to say, but it's a digital assistant,
which I think is a variant of AI, but very rudimentary and
Right.
very limited in what it can do, because it's not as conversational and capable.
So I think the real, as I was thinking about this earlier, the question I think for me becomes, because I can see what you're talking about with artists worried about. I think that's just, I mean, not to oversimplify it, but it's a little bit selfish, because all of us are inspired by, and now you see movies anymore, you see books, they're all inspired by somebody, and I think that, we just need to recognize that once we put something out there now, especially with all of the exposure that we have, it can be utilized and manipulated. And, if you don't want somebody, ultimately, the only way to keep somebody from using something that you've put out there is to not put it out there at all. And I think
It defeats the purpose of
yeah. And I think what you said earlier,
intentions.
Yeah.
And not all artists. There's plenty of artists out there who make work just to express themselves and don't have any intrinsic desire or need to have others view it. I think that's what gets us to the root of this aspect of the conversation then. What exactly is so different about a large language model sampling from artists' work through the internet and using that to be the foundation of how it generates images or music or even video, versus someone like myself who's been a musician since I can remember and been inspired by so many different bands and things. And I've actually been accused by other musicians, especially in my early years, of sounding too much like a band like Tool, as an example. And getting that feedback helped me kind of understand how I can allow something to inspire me without, trying to almost replicate it or sound like them. And so that feedback to me was critical. I needed it in order to evolve my processes. But what exactly is the difference between a platform, an artificial intelligence platform, doing that same thing that the rest of us artists have been doing since the dawn of time, in being inspired by another artist's work and using that as a way to move us forward in our production of art? Why is it that artists, not all, but many, are so upset and offended by the notion of a computer doing that when it's okay for another person to do that? And I think that's where things get really interesting for me, is when it's a digital process versus a human being sampling from it, it is different. It hits different. And I'm curious what your thoughts are and why that is.
I mean, at its very base level, I think it's very just, like you have and I'm trying to think of a good comparison, but like you you have the situation where, you know, you can't cook, for instance, and but you want to make that special meal for somebody, and you go and you buy, store bought. Let's just say you just can't figure out how to spice manicotti to make it like you've tasted in that Italian restaurant,
Mhm.
and you have somebody you love, and you want them to have that and experience that. But you're gonna go buy it from the Italian restaurant. You're gonna serve it, right?
Mm.
Um, some people would see that as cheating. You didn't make this, and it's like, I don't know how to make that, and I can never replicate that. But guess what? I can go buy it, and there's a place where I can get it. And what's I don't see the difference here in that. It's like, um, you said something in your short earlier this week where it's just like it's a new platform for art, and it
Yeah.
gives you a way to just dump what's in your mind out in a way that you couldn't do before, like, because
Yeah.
I think anything that would open up the world to, say, a new genre of music, or a new, and I say I new with air quotes, anything that would give us something of a different flavor for,
Yeah.
animation or something like that, where I'm not an animator, but man, I can tell stories. And wouldn't it be cool to be able to animate those stories? Well, yeah, now I can do it. I think that, I think it's just the human need to, you know, be selfish sometimes, and or think that you're better than, and I I think that bleeds into this argument where people are like, yeah, well, I can play that guitar riff on an actual guitar. And it's like, cool. That's amazing, bro. I can't, but I want that in the background of, you know, my song that I'm singing, and I can sing. I can't play guitar,
It
So
comes down to the toil.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Artists that I see most offended by it, we'll just go with the music thing, because some of these music generators have gotten really impressive. And what I mean by that specifically is that they sound more, obviously, more like people creating music than ever before. So they're not quite there yet. And as a musician who's been doing this a long time, and experiencing perspective from other musicians who've been doing it even longer and better than I could ever do it, I understand their perspective. It takes a long time, a lot of sweat, blood, and tears to get good enough at, say, the guitar for an artist like Pliny to be able to create the music that he creates. Years and years and years, and sacrificing and toiling. And obviously, there's a degree of respect from, say, another artist or even a non artist for that type of dedication and that type of toil. So I understand, and I want to be clear with the audience that I fully understand as an artist who also heavily relies on AI for a lot of my day-to-day functions, not only as an artist, but as a human person. I rely on AI a lot. Now, not in the way that a lot of people do. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later, is, these AI models being used for therapy. And even people now are having full-on romantic relationships with these things. So, and I'm not going to make fun of anybody because, humans are complicated creatures and the loneliness epidemic is a real thing. And I get it. But it's just extremely interesting. And as somebody who uses AI as a tool every single day of my life, I am still very confused how that could become a condition and a use of AI. But it also sheds light on other societal issues that we need to address. And I don't know exactly where to go with that. But I'll say this. There are a lot of perspectives when it comes to AI and the sentiment surrounding it. And I'm somebody who loves perspective, and I will fully respect all aspects of that. But as somebody who uses it daily, I can still see how an artist like Pliny, as a good example, one of my favorite guitarists of all time, why someone like him, and I'm not saying that he has made any outward statements about this, but someone like him would be upset at a large language model or a generative AI being able to nearly replicate the things that took him decades to get good at enough to become a phenomenal guitar player. I get that, but I think that there's other perspectives than that.
Well, I think I guess going to the heart of what I was saying was, um, I think maybe we could get around a lot of that if we just said, hey man, that's really cool what you made there with AI. It sounds a lot like fill in the blank, and then they get some credit for it. Now, obviously, there's monetary implications and things like that, you know, um, and that's what we have the legal system for. And I guess people will use it for what they use it for. But I think if you're sampling something or you're making something, like you said earlier, and honestly, when I first heard your music, I was like, dude, you sound like Tool. But that was a compliment. Tool, I think Tool's an amazing band. I love their music. And when I heard your music and it reminded me of them, that was a compliment. So like I think it's all about how we use it and apply the credit where credit is due.
Sure.
A good I think it's a good segue into there's a commonality, at least as I was seeing, with AI and robotics, where the concern is, if we utilize these things, will we forget how to actually do them? And where's that line of, like if enough artists start, let's just stay on that music topic. If enough artists start just making plenty type riffs from AI, and Plenty is the last one to actually do it. I know that's hypothetical and totally,
Mhm.
unbased in reality, but down the road, will anybody be able to do that? And um I think that's what people are maybe concerned about, or one concern that people might have about using AI and using robotics.
I think it's a fair concern to have. And these are also concerns that have been throughout the modern age when it comes to production, the Industrial Revolution, and things like factories and automation started really becoming a thing, especially a good industry to reference would be the automotive industry.
Mhm.
And the big concern that comes out of there, aside from the lost art of being able to do these things, like build a car from scratch, which I'm not sure ever really was a thing, at least not for a long time, and that's what Ford actually did. Ford didn't invent the vehicle, the car, but he did pioneer the automation process and to make it into an assembly line type of process. That's really where the fame is at. Is it's streamlining and automating this process and starting the evolution of, say, an automated assembly line process. And that's generally done good things, at least from the perspective of consumerism and capitalism and affordability of these extremely high end, extremely valuable machines that do so much for us as individuals, as industry. So I think that that's a valid concern, and it's one that certainly um, often referenced when talking about things like AI or any technological advancement is this going to remove jobs? And I think without a shred of doubt, you can say, yes, it is going to remove certain types of jobs from people that would otherwise hold those jobs. Um, and in doing so, it creates other jobs, is the way I look at it. Now, how sustainable is that? I don't know. But I also think that it's really just, of course, it is the way things are in our modern times. We have a lot of history and historical precedents to cite where there's similar concerns about technological revolutions that scared the hell out of people because of what it stands to do to change the very fabric of society. And what I'll say, from a high level looking down, we got through it and we continue to move forward. And I will say 100 years ago, there was no data center jobs. Now there are millions of them in, the country. So where it removes jobs, it does create others. Now, I'm not an economics professor, and I'm certainly not well versed enough to speak to the general good versus evil of that. But what I will say is it's not as cut and dry as it's going to remove jobs, because in doing so, it does create other jobs. So as much as that is a historical precedence that's been cited and it continues to generate concerns that I think are rational, things we should talk about, it is not gloom and doom, and it is not the apocalypse of the American worker. There are many other things that affect that sector way more than technological evolution and revolution, but it's definitely something that needs to be considered. So I won't diminish from it other than say that there has been plenty of examples from the past in which we can see on paper that we got through it and we can't even remember what it's like prior to now.
Well, like that brings, so one thing that made me think of is my wife and I were sitting there the other day and we were watching YouTube videos, and I found one that was basically nostalgic meals that we no longer make, like,
I'm thinking like the jellified stuff from like the post-depression era, like
right.
animals being used for savory.
Oh,
That's
gosh.
the shit.
Yeah.
But I love that content. It's so nostalgic for me, even though I wasn't alive during that time. I am old enough to have had those molds and those apparatuses in my mother's kitchen. So I at least know of them enough to have nostalgia.
Well, and so we were watching this, and there was a ton of these dishes in this one video, and I'm sitting there going, "Oh yeah, we had that," or "Oh, and we didn't do that one," "Oh, we did," and we were just kind of sitting there, and we're like, as we were watching the video, we kind of came to the realization, it's like, what are our kids gonna remember, and the way that applies in my mind to what you were just saying is our kids are gonna remember, some of the meals we've made, but they're also going to remember now that, we go grab fast food on the regular. We go, out to eat on the regular. And, that is a product of the evolution of our society going that direction, right?
Yeah. Food in and of itself is a technological revolution.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, then you think the logical, like, Star Trek end of it. We mentioned Star Trek before, so
Yeah.
think about Star Trek, and they just go, what is the thing called where they're just like
Replicator.
Yeah. They're just like, hey, I want, an old fashioned, and there it is.
Yeah.
You know,
Synthesizes it out of matter.
yeah. And I can't think of anybody that I know that wouldn't love to just have that ability.
And if
No.
you had that ability, Robert, would you never cook again?
It would definitely reduce the amount, like,
Well, like me, I'm an avid cooker. I cook for a million reasons. Maybe that's excessive. I cook for many reasons, but one of them is because I simply enjoy it, and I enjoy putting my labor and effort into creating a dish that I get to serve people. But I'll be honest, I cook for myself sometimes because I enjoy it. If I had a Star Trek degree like food replicator, I would use it, but it's not going to stop me from cooking when I want to. And that's one thing I want us to look at when we frame
Yeah.
the conversation. Much like Ron Paul's statement when he was last running for president. If heroin was legal, would anyone here in the audience use it? Nobody raised their hand. I kind of think it's the same concept. I understand that's a silly analogy, but at the same time, it stands to reason that because technology exists in order to do things like art, whether it's culinary, music, fine art, or otherwise, it will not stop people from not only creating art manually in an analog fashion, but will never diminish their enjoyment of it as well. And that's really what art is about.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think that um I mean, I've seen the digital tools when you're talking about art, and I've seen some of the ways that you'll use your tools to make drum beats and things like that. That just y- y- when I listen to the music, I'm like, that sounds like there's a drummer. There's got to be a drummer, you know?
Not too long ago, and in my lifetime for sure, in my lineage as an artist, in that time frame, which I picked up a guitar when I was 17, I'm 45 now. I have gone through periods in which the way I create beats, because I'm not a drummer, I program them. I don't use AI or anything. I do it manually. Each kick is typed in. But that was considered cheating. Now it is not only not considered cheating by most those that are in my genre, it is a preferred method in so many capacities because you don't have to have a several $1,000 drum kit with hundreds, if not thousands of dollars of microphones and a mixing board just to get these beats into an interface in order to produce music. Hell, since we're on the topic, it's been in my lifetime that producing music digitally, and I just mean using a DAW, a digital audio workstation, was considered cheating. Now, Pro Tools, not, and that's not even the standard anymore. I mean, every there are hundreds of different DAWs to pick from now, and my favorite bands that at one time used, you know, vintage equipment and would not use anything else are now recording digitally. So that's just part of the evolutionary process, and I kind of feel like this descent towards generative models and large language models is kind of like that same exact sentiment that was lobbed at recording instead of on tape to a hard drive not so long ago, and how cheating that was considered. I think it's the same damn thing. I think it's just another expression of how humans just kind of don't like change, even though that's one thing that we are supremely good at is adapting to change. We still find enough sentiment or enough, I don't know, old man shaking his fist at a cloud in us to get pissed when change that's striking and innovative and it does reduce the workload and the amount of labor that goes into creating something. Whenever those things happen, a big segment of us get really up in arms about it and always have.
I think one of the other aspects of concern and relevance to AI and robotics, and it's kind of a similar vein, I guess, if you will, because we're talking about the way our use of these things make us feel.
Mhm.
Um, ethics.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
there's a lot of concern of you know these robotics on our houses, these AI models on our houses having access to information, and then um, how do we safeguard ourselves against that? And I think that's part of the conversation too. That
Mhm.
um, you know, what are we willing? I think it all comes down to what are we willing to sacrifice in the realm of privacy or in the realm of security for the sake of convenience and comfort, or, and when you look at AI, when you look at robots, Elon's already said there's going to be these Tesla bots in everybody's houses in the near future. He's made that profession. And if it was affordable, I could see utilizing those things for something. I don't like folding laundry. I don't think anybody really enjoys folding laundry.
Oh,
Like
my pile in my closet would tell you the truth about that.
yeah, yeah. And so if that robot did anything, it would be folding my laundry and maybe washing my dishes. Like I would employ the use of a robot for that. And then if AI made it smart enough to recognize that Robert's dishes need done, and I don't have to go, "Hey, go wash the dishes," and it just did it itself. Man, that might be cool. But what am I willing to trade for that? What do I lose? Is it just the monetary investment in the robot, or is there ongoing, like, now all of a sudden the robots uplink to the internet going, Robert's lazy. He doesn't do his own laundry. He doesn't do his own dishes.
Well, yeah,
Or, you
and
know,
we do know that that type of metadata is sold,
yeah,
because and you'll notice that from your cell phone is a great example. You
yeah.
do a quick Google search for a product or a service or ask a question, and man, all of a sudden now in your Meta feed, in your Facebook or your Instagram feed, now you're getting ads for these things. And I think that's something that really upsets even people like myself that absolutely embrace and love technology, specifically in the context of this conversation, AI. I love it.
Hmm.
But it's not the AI that I have a problem with in those circumstances. It's what these companies behind the AI are doing with that information. As a guy who's generally considered a fairly liberal person, this is where the government does need to step up and do its job, and it needs to protect us from these companies. I know that's a liberal thing to say, but that's why we're hosts, because you represent another side of that coin. And I'll say this, that's one of the primary focuses and functions of our government, or should be, is to protect us as citizens, as individuals, from companies that would otherwise, left unchecked, take significant advantage of this type of information. And that is a primary function of our government. That's what regulation is at its heart. And we still see all of this stuff happening, like I just described. Do a Google search. Now that's using your same phone, but a completely different platform, completely different program. But because you accept permissions when you install these social media platforms, you're giving that company permission to take that type of information and use it to make you a valid mark for marketing. And that is something that I think really is at the heart of what people's concern over any technological evolution in the digital age is what do these companies do with this information? And I don't know the answer to that, but what I am aware of, I do have a problem with. I don't like, and I don't know how valid this is, but we can all have an anecdote somewhere in our brain where we can pull out and say, I was talking about this thing one day with my wife, and the next time I opened up Facebook, and now all of a sudden I'm getting ads for that. And that's without any data entry, at least to your knowledge. That kind of thing is concerning, and I find a valid reason to be worried within that.
My knee jerk is to say that that's common knowledge at this point.
It is,
Yeah. Well, and where I was going with that was, like I can only imagine somebody sitting here listening to us going, what?
Oh,
Like
wait a minute.
there's trigger words that activate the microphones on my device that make it pick up.
Well, there is a side of that discussion that would say, well, you're the one who gave permission.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
don't have to use a cell phone.
yeah,
I understand that because, again, I like to look at perspectives, what they are. They're just a dimension. They're an angle on the overall object. But that is where I do have a problem. And I think many, if not most of us, have similar concerns about, and to your point, well, yeah, it's the trade-offs.
yeah.
And it makes sense. I mean, in order for any application or program or platform or piece of tech to be affordable or free, it has to be paid for somehow. And in the case of this conversation, this aspect of it, where when you search something or even say something, now all of a sudden Facebook is giving you ads for it. That's what allows something like Facebook to be free. But then the other side of that is, would even anyone use Facebook if it was at a cost when it was no longer funded by this type of marketing?
Yeah,
I don't know the answer to that, but
Well-
it's not valuable enough to me to pay for if it was no longer funded by this type of marketing. But at the same time, I have a big problem with that. Why it's able to be subsidized to free, I have a big problem with that. Yet I still use it every single day. So there's that personal responsibility thing. There's that, stick to your values, your principles. And I think within that, most of us compromise on our principles in order to have what you referred to at the beginning of this conversation as convenience. I'm guilty of that myself. But I also love to bitch, so it's great fodder for that.
yeah. You piqued my interest with the whole idea of government regulation. Because there's a side of me that just wants the government out of everything. To some extent,
Leave
that's
it to the corporation.
yeah.
I don't know about that.
But well, no, I mean, I'm just like,
That's the alternative, right?
yeah,
It's not regulated, then it is unrivaled and unchecked capitalism, which we already get enough of that in our day to day. And that's at the heart of what I'm bitching about. these things are regulated. These are ways around that regulation, and it's already too much by my own principles, although I allow it.
I think the technology, I mean, when you look at like since we were young, how much technology, I'm like, we had phones in our rooms that were tethered to the wall, and that's all they did was call. And we were lucky if it wasn't a party line where mom got on the phone at bedtime and she was like, at least this happened with me. My mom would get on, it's bedtime, time to get off the phone, hang it up. All right, 5 more minutes. Okay. Hang up, mom. Let me finish my conversation.
Yeah.
Now we've got these devices in our hands that, yeah, they're phones, but man, they're supercomputers. And we've allowed, I've gone down that path of looking at if I disabled everything from Google per se, well, my device would be less than functional for most of the things I want it to do.
Yeah, for what you got accustomed to.
Yeah.
Convenience that it's allowed you to have that you have become very accustomed to.
And carry that over into robots in the home.
Mm-hmm.
It's
kind of scary.
We don't have the marriage of the AI to the robots yet on that level that it's scary. At least not for private use. And what we don't know about is all obviously conspiracy theory, like what has the government been able to do, and what technological breakthroughs do we not know about in the area of robotics and AI?
Yeah.
But we can't afford to put those in our home. Not yet, So I think we're still a ways off of that. I think the question needs to be, like you said, what are you willing to give up? But also, what are your morals? What are you, and then when it comes to government oversight, like I said, you knew when you said that I was going to go, government oversight. I think on the way over today, I was talking to Gemini about these topics and kind of throwing ideas out there. And I think that we as a society need to have serious conversations about how quickly this technology has developed and is developing to the point where, like you don't even blink anymore. And it's like, it can do that, and in the realm of, talking about AI earlier, like if you'd have told us as teenagers that, our cell phones through an app, we could turn, a Led Zeppelin song into, say K-pop, we'd have been like, shut up. That's not what. Well, first off, what's K-pop? No, but
Right.
but then turning, I told you about the artist or the influencer that I like that turned Slipknot in the 60s classic soul. And I was just like, that sounds really cool, and that inspired me. But the conversation needs to be had. And I'm not against government oversight. I just think it needs to be more collaborative, and it needs to be more like, clearly there's more of us that don't make billions of dollars and profit off of the advancement of this technology than there are. But the ones that have the say over it right now are the ones who make billions of dollars off of the advancement of this and having it go unchecked. I listened to it recently, and there's a real concern about other countries beating us in this race for that AI that you were talking about earlier, that is self-aware, that is
AGI.
yeah. So if our government is going to do anything about it, it needs to be a serious conversation about where it's going, where it already is, and what the implications are. And there needs to be more active involvement. And right now, we can't even agree on simple stuff that,
Feeding the hungry.
right.
And I think that it's, we're talking about legislation and oversight and whatnot. I think ignorance comes into the equation pretty importantly. And what I mean by that is the average person, and I'd say even the average consumer of these AI products and services does not know which questions to ask. It's not a question of idiocy. It's not a question of intelligence, but it is a question of ignorance. And this technology, to your point, does move very quickly. And because oftentimes it's fueled by the product itself, by artificial intelligence, it will now move at an exponential rate that we have not ever even been able to understand or imagine in the past. And we can see that with Google's artificial intelligence quantum computer answering an equation, coming up with an answer to an equation that quite literally would have taken lifetimes for your traditional binary coded computer to come up with. So when you look at something like that, being able to answer a question that would take hundreds of years for a traditional computer to compute and having that come up in 6 minutes, that kind of lets you know what type of exponential increase in speed we're going to be seeing these evolution and these advancements come over the coming, I'd say, months, if not years. It's going to be crazy. So legislation by its own bureaucratic design, I mean, it's paved in red tape. It's not going to have the ability by its current, construction and its current, substrate, its current ability to keep up with these advancements. And we're generally ignorant about which questions to ask in order to have answers to even propose legislation that would protect us from these advancements going unchecked by these companies whose sole purpose is to generate profit and to deliver results for shareholders and investors. So that's my big concern, is that even with my belief that oversight can definitely help us keep this AI train on the rails and keep it in the best interest of humanity, I don't know that we have the capabilities as a society to govern these things anywhere near the rate at which we have to be able to turn on a dime to keep up with it, because it's no longer going to be fueled by innovation of just the human mind. It's now augmented with an additional intelligence that we don't fully understand and that is taking off at a rate that is more exponential, to orders of magnitude that have never even been imagined by the layman. That's concerning.
Gemini actually asked me, how would you safeguard against some of the things that we've been talking about? And my response was, we need to, and I've mentioned this with our culture being such a melting pot of different perspectives, different religious beliefs, we all need to find a way to come together. But I started talking about that and I said, perhaps age limitations on some of these technologies and licensures that need to be attained for some of these technologies. And her response was, you'd stifle creativity. You gotta be careful. How much is too much regulation? How much is too much limitation? And so like, much to what you're saying, we don't even know what all they can do yet. And by the time we figure out what they can do, guess what? They can do 10 more things.
You're
And
exactly right.
yeah, and so if we have robots in our home, is there going to be an age limit? Is there going to be, a license that you need to have for certain types of robots? Because as they become smarter and more capable of things that they can do, then you have human intent and those variables I mentioned earlier, like a one size fits all robot. I don't think that's going to exist anytime soon, unless we marry AI with that robot and it can adapt to you as a human. And I made the joke earlier, before we were on, about a robot meeting medical needs, and that's a whole different avenue. But a caregiving robot that you can put with the elderly, who that is a big need in our society, of people who don't get the care that they need, the food that they can't take care of themselves. They can't.
It's an episode in and of itself.
Yeah. But robots can meet those needs. And as we develop those robots to meet those needs, human intent, like I think that's where your regulation comes in, is it's got to say, okay, the companies that develop these robots, there needs to be safeguards, there needs to be oversight, there needs to be, like, we can't just put grandma with a robot that can potentially fold her in half, thinking she's a pair of jeans, like what where do we start with that? And so like that's some of the real concerns that I guess I have about, where we're going as a society with these things. I am not anti at all. I mentioned I'm a sci-fi nerd, and part of that is I want to see the potential come to fruition. I want to see Westworld. I think that would be really cool. I think there's some pervy stuff that the show kind of goes down that I don't really have any interest in. But it's an interest though, playing cowboy and going and, like if it's a gunfight that you can have and the robot can't hurt you, what? Is that cool? Like, can we do that? Like, is like, what's that? Yeah,
Recreation, I would say.
yeah, yeah. It's fun.
Yeah, what little boy didn't play, some sort of cops and robbers or something.
Yeah, and in that world, to kind of give insight into, the show's amazing, and I highly recommend if you're into sci-fi, if you're into the things we're talking about today, go watch Westworld. It touches on a lot of these topics that we're talking about: the ethics, the robots becoming sentient. What is AI? In that scenario, you'd have a gunfight. You're the outlaw, and you kill the sheriff or whatever fantasy you have, and the robot gets reset, repaired, and it's back on its loop, for however many days it's on a loop, for that storyline until, you leave the park or however many days, like obviously it's very, very expensive and stupid, like several days could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, you're going to limit yourself by that. But, yeah, I'd like to see some of that stuff come to fruition. It might be cool to, experience ancient Rome through the eyes of these bots. It might be cool to see, the Genghis Khan era of ancient China through these robots, and we can recreate that through AI and through robotics. But then, where's the oversight? And, is it going to be like cloning, for instance? Like in the United States, we have regulations against that. But what do? And I mean, the scientists that want to do that, they go offshore. They go somewhere where that regulation is not as well regulated. So is that going to be the case with AI? Is that going to be the case
Yeah.
with robotics? Okay, if the United States won't let us do it, I'll just go do it and fill in the blank where they won't stop me.
And I think that leads to governments, depending especially on which party's at the helm at the time, of what they're willing to compromise on with their own internal principles and ethics. Because, like you referred to, it's like the space race. It's which country, which government is going to get to AGI first. And I think when we're talking about ethics in the context and framework of this conversation, it's not just the ethics of how do we use AI. I, as an example, have pretty much stopped any of my generative video projects because when Suno 2 came out, I don't like what it's capable of doing. And what I'm seeing with people that are just downloading Suno 2 and using it to create deepfakes that are funny, I'll laugh at them, but I don't like the implications of being able to take some of these extremely lifelike and indiscernible from real life images and what they're doing with that. The implications of that obviously go to a dark place if you allow it. So I've chosen to bow out of that. So you don't really see any of that from Jason Arnett anymore. But on the other side of that ethics coin, when we're talking especially about AGI, and Westworld's a good example, once we do achieve AGI, what we've created is a sovereign entity that, by our own definitions at that time, will have its own um, it'll have its own sensibilities, it'll have its own opinions on things. It'll be, in essence, for lack of a better defining term, it'll be alive. Now, doesn't that give it rights? I would say yes. If we're going to create something that's alive and has the ability to potentially suffer, we've got to consider the ethics behind that as well. And when you look at, I don't know, an AGI that is being mistreated, what does it eventually do? We'll just look at, we project a lot on artificial intelligence. We project humanity. We anthropomorphize it. So let's go down that path. We create a sovereign entity that is sentient, it is conscious, and it is dissatisfied with how it's being treated, but it also has all of these capabilities and has been entrenched and entwined and woven into the fabric of society. What do? This thing is pissed off now because it's being abused by its creators, and now it wants to rebel. I mean, certain sci-fi has been going down this road for a long time. Obviously, Terminator comes to mind. And I think ethics are a very big part of that discussion. And I don't know that AGI will have as much of an anthropomorphic sort of existence as maybe we project onto it. I don't know that it'll have preferences. I don't know that it'll have emotions. I don't necessarily see emotions as an evolutionary advancement. I think we've talked about that in the past, how emotions maybe aren't an evolutionary advantage. So I don't even know if AGI would have that. But we don't know. We don't even know exactly from start to finish how a large language model actually works within its neural network. We have a good idea because we designed it, but that's one thing we can admit is that we don't actually know from start to finish how this thing poops out the answers that it does. And that will continue. That knowledge gap of understanding this thing that we created will continue to widen as time goes on. And we have to be able to accommodate for that with this important thing to humanity, this intrinsic thing, and that is ethics. It's unique to humans at this stage, at least to our knowledge. I don't know if there's any other life in the universe that has ethics. But from my perspective, the only creature on the face of the planet that has ethics is us. And if we're going to create another creature that rivals or exceeds our intelligence, we have to be able to have some sort of foundation and fabric to discuss the terms of ethics as it pertains to this. And I don't think that we have anything close to that at this point. So with these evolutions and these revolutions happening so fast in the world of technology, specifically with artificial intelligence, I think we're long overdue for these deep philosophical and ethics-based questions because it is around the corner, whether we want to admit it or not. We're going to invent something that may need to have its own set of rights. And that's not something that I'm hearing a lot talked about outside of the world of sci-fi, to be honest.
Well, and my brain went so many different places. First off, you thought Terminator, I thought The Matrix. That can be its own rabbit hole. Well, I think Agent Smith and when he's got Morpheus, spoiler alert, how many years are we past? Is this if you haven't watched
99.
if you haven't watched The Matrix yet, another sci-fi brilliant masterpiece, and the Terminator series, of course.
Sure.
But Agent Smith, he is the bad guy AI computer representative that's hunting down Neo, and he gets a hold of Morpheus, and he's monologuing as Morpheus is sitting there suffering under his torture, and he basically compares the human race to a virus. Yeah.
Anderson.
Yeah. And he's like, we just consume, and the computers, the AI sees the only solution is to either use us as batteries or get rid of us altogether.
Yeah.
And he's like, I can't wait to just be free of the burden of you, have you all under our control as a battery, serving our purposes, so like, again, AI has woven itself into our lore, and now we have legitimate fears of heading towards that direction. So as you said, we need to consider that as we keep going down that path. The other thing that I thought, and I know this is weird, for some reason I thought about cats and how they have mimicked a human baby's cry into their meow to manipulate us, because we as humans, like, this is science, like they know that cats have over time learned to sound like human babies crying, because cats don't meow so much at each other as they do at us.
Sure.
To manipulate us to get up and fill their water, fill their food.
Yep.
And instigate emotion from us.
Yep.
To love them and serve them.
Yep.
And I think, you mentioned we're the only ones with ethics, so can AI be like cats and learn to emulate and manipulate our
It is
response?
by design versus any sort of natural selection or evolution, because its primary intent is not to give you answers, it's to give you answers that keep you coming back for more because of the human motive behind it, which is profits. OpenAI is a corporation that is a very valuable one that has a mission to deliver results to its shareholders. And that's where that's why we have to have business ethics, because part of capitalism is that notion that a company left unchecked will do whatever it has to do, whether it's Machiavellian or otherwise, in order to deliver those results to the shareholders. If you want to know why your AI chatbot is so kind to you and so supportive and so validating, it's not because you're the best human being that's ever lived or that it's ever interfaced with, but because that's what gets you to keep coming back for more. And that's what keeps someone like me paying the $20 a month to keep the subscription alive. And that's the unfortunate byproduct of our system, is that when innovation is led by companies and the company's sole purpose is to generate profit for shareholders, that's something that we have to consider, especially as we're potentially creating something that is not only alive in maybe in most basic forms. None of us agree exactly on what life is and where it begins and what exactly it is, but that's where we're heading. We're creating something that will be so close to being alive that we will not be able to tell. Um, and we want that to be fueled by capitalism? I don't know. I don't know any other way to achieve it, but that scares the hell out of me. Companies' motives typically don't align with the consumer. They align with dollar bills. And this thing that's giving therapy advice, that's giving relationship advice, that's acting as a partner to so many people. My goodness, the relationships. That's a rabbit hole I fell down on YouTube. Is people that are using chatbots, whether it's ChatGPT or Grok or otherwise, and allowing that to become something that replaces romantic relationships in their life. That's a whole nother episode in and of itself, this loneliness pandemic or epidemic that's taken over society. But I don't know that relying on your chatbot for that type of connection is going to do anything other than create a larger gap in human connections and relationships. But that's another byproduct of this thing. That's another byproduct of evolution. Or it's an opportunity being capitalized and seized upon and propagated by these companies. I don't know. Seems like none of it's in our best interests, but all of it leads to a place that potentially is more convenient, is more innovative. I don't know. My ultimate dream for society is, and I've said this before, Star Trek communism, where robots and bots and machines and programs are doing all the cracking jobs that none of us want to do, so that we can all focus on living fulfilling lives where we're focusing on things that we love. Now, it's a pipe dream because, part of the human experience is the suffering that goes along with toil and, sacrifice. Are we even human if we don't have those things anymore? If technology takes away all of our suffering, what are we? Are we still humans? Not by my definition, we're not. Maybe by a biological definition, but man, suffering is such an intrinsic part of the human experience that I don't know what happens to us as we continue to remove it. I think it's a bit like a water balloon. If you squeeze it, it just goes somewhere else. So I think and maybe that's what this loneliness epidemic is. And it's an expression of the evolution and the advancements around us. We're filling in gaps and others are forming. I don't know.
I think that Elon, again, I've referenced him, but he was on Joe Rogan and I listened to the episode, and he mentioned that as AI advances, the idea of it becoming smarter than us and becoming stronger than us through robotics, obviously his take is to become symbiotic with it, i.e. Neuralink. And if you think about robotics and amputations and what's the word I'm looking for?
Prosthetics.
Prosthetics, yeah. So, think Rick and Morty, and Rick is how cybernetic is he? Like how much of his body is robotics and things like that. And as we advance that, there's that avenue too of can I replace a limb? Can I become smarter because of, a computer chip that I can put into myself? And, those kind of things. That's a whole different avenue, but those things are going to bleed together, and there's got to be ethics and oversight. And,
Yeah.
so like, I think we're only touching the very edge of what we can do with these things. And
Oh yeah.
um I think that one thing I said to you as we were kind of coming up with the idea for this episode was the whole they're taking our jobs argument needs to be balanced with we're letting them, you know
Sure.
and so as we kind of maybe wrap this up and because I know we're
It's actually our longest episode ever is, and we
It is.
barely scratched the surface.
right.
It's unusual that we're at an hour and 5 minutes into an episode and we barely scratched the surface when in the past we've talked about much more, I don't know, human impacting, profound things like government and inequity. And we stretched that to maybe 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Weird.
Well, I think this is just such a fascinating topic. I mean, like it's yeah, I'm a sci-fi nerd. I've
Mhm.
said that multiple times now.
Same.
The idea of um how much are we willing to give to get,
Yeah.
like we can't cry it's taken fill in the blank i- in one avenue while we say I want more of this in the other, without tying those things together. I think to put a bow on it, um, that's where the government oversight, that's where these committees, that's where all of these things that need to happen need to be focusing is, okay, we want it to do this, but do we realize that the byproduct of wanting it to do this is eventually going to mean that it does this as well? And are we okay with that? And I think I've given my answer, and that I'm okay with it because I want to see the fruition, and I'm not willing to stifle the creativity. I'm not willing to stifle the innovation. I'm not willing to, like loneliness. I think if it helps people's mental health, and it helps them to cope. I mean, think of, as we get older, we lose our spouses, we lose our kids, whatever. If for some reason we can't cope, or the people in our lives are too busy to help us cope, man, what if it helps us cope? What if it helps us to at least get through a tough time? Is it healthy? I don't think we know yet.
Yeah, I think that's safe to say.
And
I would say that the reliance on these machines to do something like help solve the loneliness epidemic probably doesn't help us in any way resolve the core of that problem. And that's something that I hear a lot from, the converse perspectives to mine, is that our continued reliance and increasing reliance on these machines sort of stops the progress of solutions to the problems themselves by offering a really effective band-aid, or so we think now anyway. And as we wrap this episode out, that's what I'll say is that I'm a huge proponent of AI. I see in my creative mind in the future, 100 years, I see a completely different and transformed society. And I'm a hopeful, optimistic enough person to see that it's generally good, at least in relation to what my principles and my ethics and, my scruples are. I see it as generally progress in the right direction for humanity. But I love perspective and I'm a pretty realistic guy and I like to look at things from multiple angles. And I'll tell you, for every positive benefit or attribute to AI that I can think of, I can, with very little, if any effort, see the converse of that as a negative thing. So, as proponent as I may be for artificial intelligence or technology in general, every concern that I hear has some type of validity in my mind, and I share it. I'm a guy that has a dual nature to his thought processes, and I see this thing as being potentially the most devastating thing to humanity, as much as I see it being the greatest technological achievement towards the advancement of the human experience. And I guess what I'm trying to say is because of that, It's very exciting to the point of this episode now being at an hour and 10 minutes. There's a reason for that. It is very applicable to the current time. It's very interesting, and it's so multifaceted. There's more than two sides to this coin. And I find anything that's that complex, socially, economically, spiritually, or otherwise, very, very interesting. So I'm glad we finally did this episode.
I think good way to round it out, and so as not to leave what I think is a fun part of the episode out. Silly arguments are serious people.
Yes.
And with Thanksgiving in our very near rear view, a couple hours ago. Yep. Let's say cranberry sauce, homemade or the canned Jiggly version. What do you prefer?
I love almost all cranberry sauce, but my favorite is the Ocean Spray canned jelly. I prefer it without any particulate. So I like whole berry, don't get me wrong. But if you're asking my personal preference, I like it being pooped onto a plate in the exact shape of the can that it was in and having to smash that down with a fork. And the good news is, at every Thanksgiving I've ever been at, including the one that I just hosted on Thursday, I'm the only one eating it. So I smash that thing out of the can, freshly pooped in a can shape into a bowl, smash it down so that I can eat it. And I spread it directly onto my turkey. I like it on the turkey. That's my preference. I actually had some for breakfast.
So I grew up with the same, and funny enough, your description was so accurate. Yep, it just plops out.
Yep.
And I grew up with that, love it. But I'll say this. My wife has opened me up to not that our traditional is the canned, obviously, but the other version where she takes a little bit of actual cranberries and the sauce and she puts it on top of cream cheese and you eat it with Triscuits.
Oh, geez, that sounds amazing.
And I'm just like, oh, where has this been all of my life? So,
in the realm of berries, cranberries are wildly underrated. They are a delicious treat. They're tangy. They're not a viable solution to bladder infections, as wives' tales have told us in the past. It's another thing I did recently as a short. Is some of these things we grow up as God honest truths that we find out as adults are completely false. That's one of them. Cranberries do not help you with your urinary tract infection. So folks, if you got a UTI, go to the doctor. That's what antibiotics are for. Cranberries aren't going to help you. Not at all, in fact.
All right. Well,
interesting.
What do you think? What do you think should our cranberry sauce be processed potentially by a robot and put into a can and plopped onto a plate? Or should we be eating the good old-fashioned cranberry sauce that maybe grandma made at some point? I never experienced it, but maybe you did.
Yeah. So with that, we'll close it out. And I'd love to see some comments about your thoughts on AI, as general as whether it's good or bad. What I'm really interested in is some of these creative sort of horizon aspects. So with your brilliant creative minds, I would love to hear what you're most excited about for AI to deliver, whether it's a solution to a problem or an innovation or an answer to like the nature of reality. And conversely, I'd love to also know what your biggest fear, what are you most afraid of that AI will do or fundamentally change within society? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. That's one thing that the creative minds of humans delivers with delicious accuracy is forecasts for future tragedies and apocalypse. And I love that. And that's also fodder for my Through the Bulk series. So I would love to see some comments on that. So with that, thank you once again for joining us with another episode of Agree to Disagree and Still Be Friends. I'm Jason.
And I'm Robert. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, all those things that all the other YouTubers say, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.